to the Birch John Society meeting. I mean, I would think all of you should be welcome and invited now that I'm leaving town. This meets the first Thursday of the month. He doesn't want any of you there. I would show up if I were you. He can explain later what that means. I don't even understand it. Birch John Society is one of the exclusive clubs.
There's the bylaws are that you have to come and tell the truth. You can't talk business.
Right. If you talk any business, you get thrown out on your ear, and if you have to bring a joke, it doesn't matter if it's the same joke every month, you just have to show up with it too. It's class operation. Well, I came here with certain fear and trepidation for a number of reasons. Last 6 months ago, the Ohio District Youth Gathering Committee, whoever they are, invited me to come and make a presentation, which happened to be last weekend. And they've sent me mail since then. And we've stuck it in the file like we do. And then about a week ago, I looked in the file to find out what the Ohio District Youth Gathering wanted me to do. And I found out that they wanted me to do 9 hours. I was the only program for the entire weekend. All they had planned was meals. So, I had just spent dealing with youth. I mean, it's just a horrible weekend. I about died after about 2 minutes, thinking, golly, 9 more hours or something. Then they had things like a videotape player that didn't work, and a movie projector that was locked in a closet, and nobody had a key, and microphone that worked sometimes. That's worse than not having one at all, by the way. Oh, it was bad. Well, that's all. You folks, or at least Cindy asked me to come and talk about grace and commitment. I don't know how to spell that. Is that 2 M's or 1? 2 M's and 1 T? Huh? 2 T's? 2 T's? It's either 1 or 2 T's. Right. Oh, there's one here. Yeah. How do you spell it? Grace and commitment. Well,
You know a lot about commitment, obviously.
obviously, yeah. Lutherans, I guess you're all Lutheran, aren't you? I've tried to listen when we're going around. If not, pretend you are. Lutherans have a hard time with the whole matter of commitment. What's it mean? We are so afraid of works righteousness that we spend a great deal of our time avoiding the subject, pretending it'll go away. Much of what the problem for Lutherans is, we know a lot about getting people up to the door of the kingdom, but don't know a lot about what we do once they get in the door. And we get all hyper when we worry about somehow or other someone's going to work their way into heaven. So you bring up the word commitment, and there's all kind of Lutheran fear and quakes. Commitment for mission, the fundraising appeal of the ALC gets papers from seminary professors on how it's a lousy name. I think it's a lousy name too, and I'll explain why for different reasons. But the whole thing of what do we do with people once people have responded to the kingdom is an issue that won't go away. We have to live in the kingdom somehow. We have to live in the church somehow. I mean, what do you do to get people to come to Luther League and count on them coming next month? Or what do you do with people who won't volunteer? How do you get people on the youth committee? Evangelism and youth are always the last 2 committees appointed in a church. It's an absolute pit of a thing to serve on. The average pastor knows he can get somebody to be on the property committee. That's relatively easy. Education committee, that's kind of easy. There's a couple of teachers, someone's going to be doing Sunday school. Worship committee, someone thinks they can sing. That's no problem. Every pastor knows you get down to the last 2, and that's always youth and evangelism. Nobody serves on the youth committee. Nobody serves on the evangelism committee. And if you're honest about it, the average pastor thinks to herself, and all of the people in this congregation, considering all the gifts that there are, and all the opportunities there are to exercise gifts, and all the things that we can do, and the vision and possibility of serving on the youth committee or the evangelism committee, who, of all the people in this whole congregation, owes me one? Then the pastor goes to that person and uses the guilt technique. You know, if you don't serve on the youth committee, nobody will. Or we won't have any youth. Our kid will be out, out in the streets, and they'll be shooting up in dark corners. But you've got to be in it. And the guilt thing usually overcomes their real truthful anxiety, and they serve for 1 year. Nobody ever serves more than, well, anyway, that's the long way around. The fact is, what does commitment, all of this mean in terms of who we are and what's it mean to be God's people? Well, let me share some things, some of which are outrageous. and then we'll talk some. Is that fair enough? Okay. And some of which we'll talk and just maybe kind of come to some conclusions in terms of where we're at. First thing is I hate the word commitment, and I told you that. It's not the right word. Commitment is not a church word. Commitment really is a legal term. It's a term from society where we have to use laws and clubs to make people do things. I'm committed personally to all kinds of things that I would rather not do. I'm committed to shoveling the snow in this weather. I'm committed to keeping the grass cut because the neighbors will talk otherwise. You know, I'm committed to going to long, interminable, boring meetings at the office. I'm committed to being treasurer of my son's Boy Scout troop. You may not think that's any big deal. Boy Scout troops write about $600 $2 checks every month. It's one of the worst jobs in the world. But anyway, if you want to be a good father, you're treasurer of the boy. Well, I'm committed to that because otherwise people will say, look, he's a lousy father, or he doesn't take care of his lawn. Commitment is really something, as long as the pressure's on, someone will do it. As long as you keep the pressure on, the kid will come to Lutherly. Mom or dad will beat him up otherwise, or they'll serve on the youth committee as long as the pressure's on. What the church doesn't need is more commitment. What the church needs is more passion. Passion is a word of the Spirit. Passion is a word of fire, of flame. Passion means that you don't just do it because you have to do it, or if you don't do it, no one else will. Passion, rather, is what happens between brothers and sisters, or between brothers, or between sisters. Passion means you do more than what's expected. Passion means that you'll do it even when someone's not expecting it, and you'll do it double, so to speak. Bottom line, what they were talking about really in the church is not to somehow or other drum up some kind of a way to get people more committed to things. What we're talking about in the church and the ultimate goal is really to drum up some kind of a way to get people more passionate about things and about other people. We're talking about how that might happen, obviously dreams about it. But the bottom line of this word commitment is really not really ultimately what we're really after. The word would better be is obedience. One who is passionate chooses to be obedient. One doesn't choose to be committed. One is forced to be committed. I think maybe that sounds like we're just kind of playing with words and so forth. But I think that what's behind that is important for us to look at. What we need with youth or with adults is really not somehow a better club to use, but rather a way for us to say, how can they become more passionate and thus obedient? Choice to be obedient. Okay? When you move beyond that and begin to say, well, okay, how does one begin to get serious then about being passionate, about being living in the kingdom? What does grace really mean, and how does that play over against kind of some choices to make? It's no secret that's been misused over and over. Part of the problem with how people get into the kingdom when we talk about grace is really a matter of geography. If we begin to think of being in the kingdom of God or being part of the passionate community as being a kind of geographical decision, that somehow all the good guys are over here, draw a line, okay, and all the bad guys are over here, then how do you get the person to move over to the line with the good guys? Then you get yourself in trouble if you start saying this person has to decide to move over, because we still confess as Lutherans in the third article, it is the Holy Spirit that calls, gathers, enlightens, and sanctifies. It is from whose point of view. A better model would be something like this, that the good guys and bad guys, so to speak, are all in the same community. It's a matter of geography and from whose point of view. The New Testament truly is already filled with all kinds of requirements or imperatives for decision. We can't avoid that in the New Testament of saying that decisions are asked for. And the New Testament is loaded with that. One can't pretend like they'll go away if we ignore them. But it's rather to say, on whose behalf is it operating? On whose behalf is the decision going to be made to move into the kingdom? If it is from my point of view, and if we're looking at it from my point of view, then somehow or other you have to find some methodology or to cause me to want to move over the line. If it is from the God's point of view, and if we take seriously that Jesus is in the midst of us and is there before we arrive, then God is the initiator. The Holy Spirit does cause persons to make changes in their life. Conversion happens because God initiates the process of conversion, not because the person initiates the process of conversion. People become passionate because they get involved with other people and with God. We get ourselves uptight about this because we often worry about for what reason does one make a decision. It seems to me that the average teenager, for example, is probably good, okay, whatever that means, not because the law will beat him up if he is not, but he rather is good, so to speak, because someone would be disappointed if he weren't. I know when I was a kid, I knew right well that if I got caught, I'd beat it. I knew it. And if the police had picked me up, I would be able to either talk myself out of it or they'd slap my wrists and I'd go on. And everybody knows stories about how, abusive father causes people to walk the straight and narrow. The truth is, ultimately, as soon as the pressure is off, that person will do whatever he or she wants. One rather, I think, does actions because people are loved. People are in community. People are in relationship to others. When we talk about the faith, we talk about relationships. We don't talk about contracts. Relationships is what causes a person to move or to become any kind of actor. Acts 1:8 says, and it's the same story from a different point of view. When the Holy Spirit has come upon you, you shall receive power, Jesus says his last words to his disciples. And you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. That you shall be my witnesses. It's a future perfect tense. You shall be my witnesses. It means that it is inevitable. It isn't a choice that one makes, but rather it's a given that you are. That's by definition. One who lives in the Holy Spirit, one who is baptized, becomes a witness by definition. It isn't a choice to be made. You shall be my witnesses. Now, the quality of your witness may vary, even at different times, but the you shall be is inevitable. Now, one has to say, who makes the decision then, or makes the choice to live as the witness? Well, once again, it is the power of the Spirit that is the actor that causes people to be the witnesses. On the other side of that, we begin to say, well, how do we relate to people? I suppose there's a couple of ways. One side, I suppose, would be very passive in terms of the witness, and the other side would be very active or very intentional. And somewhere in between, we say, well, you shall be my witnesses very passively, kind of like we build buildings, church buildings somewhere, and people are going to respond to it. That's extremely passive, okay? Or the fact that we happen to be in town, it's extremely passive. Between that and the other side, a very active means that we would very intentionally or aggressively cause people to know something, to do something, to act. Gary Knudsen puts the two ends of this continuum somewhere between here would be the Lucy mentality. You've seen that cartoon, haven't you? Lucy says to, I guess, Charlie Brown, I would have made a good evangelist. And he says, how? Why is that? She says, because I convinced my friend in school that my church is better than his church. How did you do that? Well, I hit him with my lunchbox. That's an active, you shall be my witnesses. The passive side would be sort of like Little Bo Peep, where you leave them alone and eventually they'll come home wagging their tails behind them. It's kind of ignoring the whole thing. Somewhere in between, then, is a way for us to say that things operate, that people respond in community. Somehow or other, we are responsive to people. We make people become passionate with one another. Let me throw one other thought, another model, and then we can talk about it a little bit, okay? thing that divides one denomination from another is really the definition of grace. This is very crass, by the way, and it really is for illustrative persons, not for illustrative purposes rather than delineation of something. But what grace is, and we all learn in catechism, do anybody remember? The undeserved love of God to us, or something close to that, right? Okay, it's how God has loved us. Lutherans say God has loved us in an undeserved fashion. We didn't deserve it even while we were still sinners. God loved us, etc., and all of those famous verses that you learned one time or another. Right? It's the undeserved love of God to us. Now, it's how God has loved us. Now, different denominations begin to see God loving them in different kinds of ways, and that's what divides congregation or denomination from denomination. If you took this and you drew a continuum, of grace, and over here, grace would be very objective, and over here, very subjective. That says subjective. You don't have to be able to read that, just have to nod and pretend like you do. Okay? Over here, then, grace would be something that is strictly outside of a person. Grace exists whether people like it or not. Grace is in the world. God's love floats around kind of like an amoeba or something. People aren't really involved in it. It doesn't particularly matter what people say. Grace is real. All right? It's kind of like a lump. This is crass, and I want to emphasize that again. But basically, you'd find over here traditional pre-Vatican II Roman Catholics, many of them, okay? You'd find the Orthodox over here, for sure. Some Episcopalians, as soon as the Episcopalians decide what they believe, they might find over here. Episcopalians have a problem with that. I don't know if you know that. You know that 40% of all Episcopal clergy are trained in non-Episcopal seminaries? There's something, extremely wrong with that church and that. But you put some people over here. Now this is crass, so don't go to your local Catholic friend and say, now I know what you believe. But traditionally, this kind of is where Roman Catholics were, Reformation and so forth, up to about this century. They would see grace as kind of in a lump that exists in the world. Where the lump came from was really basically, and you've heard this, the traditional piety was the treasury of merit. It was the good works that folks did. About 99% of it came from Jesus, who lived a perfect life. The saints contributed their own small measure because they end up with contributing to the treasury of merit. Who owns the grace in the world? From a traditional Roman Catholic point of view. Who owns it? Who controls it? Well, church, yeah, but more specifically than that, more than leaders. Well, the Pope, but he's the chairman of the bishops really own it, right? The Pope is really the chairman of the bishops. It's the bishops. The bishops own the grace. They control the grace. The basic function of the church, then, if you're really being crass and over here in the subjective side, is to distribute that grace to folks. And the people's reception of the grace, it's valid and real. People get grace from the lump. And the basic task of the church is to give it out in whatever way you can give it out. Can you remember, I don't suppose you do, as a child I can remember it really hating my Catholic friends. They would go to Mass for about 11 minutes. All they had to do was show up in order to, at the time of the Eucharist. They received it was perfectly valid. They were back outside on the street playing again before you could turn around. Meanwhile, I had to go to church for an hour or an hour and a half because all this other stuff was somehow important to us. But from a Roman Catholic point of view, it made perfect sense, just because you have received it. From an evangelism point of view, all that really ultimately means is that you have to get a person in the way of receiving grace. If I can just get you in the way of receiving grace, it becomes valid. And Jesuits have done it in the worst of their days. They used to march tribes through rivers and make the sign of the cross over them, and they were baptized. You've read that or heard that, right? A perfectly valid, from this point of view, evangelism technique. Just get them baptized, and grace they receive. Get them in the way of the Eucharist, they receive grace. Get them make sure the bishop can put his hand on their heads, may receive grace, no matter how they feel about it, or wherever they respond to it, whatever it means. Okay, we can talk more. So evangelism becomes the passion of inside doesn't matter, because the passion of God is what matters. On the subjective side, that's where that over here now is what the way I feel about it is of ultimate importance on this side. What grace is me and God, baby. Okay? And what I get is what God gives to me. The model here is each person receives their own measure of grace, me and God. The church is a dotted line. It's a like-minded group of people who like to be together, who seem to like to worship and study in similar kinds of ways. But the church wasn't important, really significant. Over here, we're talking about the Baptists. Okay, we're talking about the Pentecostals. Okay, we're talking about nearly all American religions which have found their identity in America. If this person doesn't like the church, what does he do or she do? Just pulls out, goes over here and got some other folks that agree with them, and they start another church. Right? That's very subjective. It's God and I on a desert island mentality. It says that what is me and God, we go together, and if I can find someone else who agrees with me, we start a church. But the church itself doesn't have any continuing reality. Grace comes to just me. It is interesting, just to play this out a little bit more, what does evangelism happen here? What do you have to convince a person to be about? It's you and God, whatever your relationship is. So grace comes to you whenever you feel like it, however you feel like it. You convert people on airplanes. Have you ever been to a meeting where an evangelist spoke where he or she didn't convert the person who sat next to him on the airplane coming to the very meeting that you were at? That story is told over and over. I have a theory about the 85 million unchurched Americans. What we ought to do, we got to get all the evangelists and put them on airplanes and fly from Los Angeles to New York to Los Angeles to Chicago to Dallas. Just keep flying them around. Eventually, everybody would be converted. We would have airplane conversions everywhere.
Real super saver.
You know it. I know when I have done an event, want to come back home, don't want to mess with anybody. I just say to them, I'm in evangelism with the ALC. Usually there's 2-3 rows empty out all around. How many of you would look forward to sitting next to an evangelist on your next airplane trip? Huh? Afraid of what that person would do to you. You can test that. You want to test that? You go to a barber shop where you're not known. You walk in and you tell the barber that you're the new evangelist in town. An amazing transformation happens in the average barber shop when that piece of good news is given to them. First thing that happens is the barber you tell this to will say very loudly, "Hello, Reverend." Now that's a signal to everybody else in the barber shop to clean up their act. All the Playboy magazines get slipped to the bottom of the pile. There are no jokes told anymore because no one wants to offend the Reverend. And the best part is, you never wait. You're always next, no matter who's in the shop. They want to chat to I don't know where we are. Anyway, how do we even get into that? The fact is, this kind of mentality where everybody has their own measure of grace and everybody does their own kind of thing and does whatever their thing is very comfortable. By the way, it's very American. Who established this country? This crowd over here? This crowd's the one who established this nation. And the mythology of America and the mythology of a subjective view of grace go hand in glove. This is the religious equivalent of the American spirit. Mother, I'd rather do it myself. Okay? Every man, every woman can be president. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Do your own thing. It's a narcissistic, do my own thing mentality. It is what made this country. Culturally, the mythology we have about ourselves and religiously is this mentality. What songs do people like to sing in church? The old gospel songs. I walk through the garden path. alone, right? My God and I, right? Amazing grace that saved a wretch like me. See, you hear where it's all coming from? It's all that I feel good about it. It doesn't matter. I have no relationship with you. And that's the gospel kind of mentality. Come on in.
Get him.
Hey. How are you, Jeff? No, you're forgiven. All right. Just got the oath of ability, actually. Anyway, this, by the way, is more European. Europeans think of faith this way. As you could guess by my chart, Lutherans don't fit neatly in either category. A model for Lutherans might be something like this. It's all of these folks together. It is God in the midst of us. We relate to God both corporately or personally, not individualistically, not individual, but personally and corporately at the same time. There's some reasons why Lutherans fit in here. It's partly because Luther himself never got around to coming up with a very valid doctrine of the church. If you read Reformation times and Reformation history, Luther waffled between both sides. Sometimes he was fairly over here, sometimes fairly over here in terms of where he was coming from. As a result, it's an interesting phenomenon we find ourselves in. One of the phenomenon of the whole thing is that the Lutheran Church is in dialogue with everybody. Like no other church in the world, every denomination is having formal talks with Lutherans because everybody has a piece of the action. Okay. And everybody deals with it in one way or another. Because we fit everywhere. But for in terms of the whole how we see grace and how we see people reacting to God, it's both personal, as I said, and it is corporate, together. We have a two-tone quality to our evangelism. Lutherans don't convert people on airplanes without simultaneously bringing them into a corporate community, into a fellowship. Grace is lived out among us. 1 John 1:3. We declare all of these things to you so that your fellowship might be with us as our fellowship is with the Father. You hear that? It's a very Lutheran passage. So we declare this so that, in order that, your fellowship may be with us as our fellowship is with the Father. It's kind of an interesting interplay of the two words. The Jesus with us. Now, a couple of things I want to warn you against. This is very crass and simplistic. Nobody fits anywhere on the chart. Okay? There are Lutherans way over here, and you know it, right? And there are Lutherans way over here, and there are Roman Catholics over here. It's merely for model rather than reality. But it does help us to think through different ways to look at how grace is operative in our lives together and separately. Now, what would passion or commitment be about? Commitment or people living their lives out gets different kind of qualities as you look at the different models. Over here, what does commitment mean? What does involvement mean? What does response mean on the left-hand side of the model? What? Right, you react to the institution. The commitment of these individuals is not necessarily to each other, but it's to the institution. You serve then the church in a very real sense. What you're doing for the church. Okay? So, and the church's function then is to generate more and more activity on behalf of the institution. It is no accident that Roman Catholics, have much of their vocation, the word vocation, is church vocation. When they talk about calling, they talk about calling in the church. Absolute officer from over here. What then does it mean over here? On this side, what would vocation, calling, commitment, like be over there? Personal piety. That's how I live my life. Yeah, it's I don't smoke, drink, swear, or tell dirty stories. Right? It is I live a good life. And that mentality says that how do we change the world? How does this side say we have to change the world? One at a time. We convert people one by one by one by one until we have a majority of folks who tend to agree with us. and then we change it. But a corporate way of operating is a different mentality. And we also enforce public morals over here too, by the way. We enforce that you act the way I want you to act, so that you don't offend me. Okay? And here, it's a different model. And then maybe this is the model we ought to concentrate on most, because what is over here, what is commitment or life in the kingdom about? What about gifts? Think about gifts. How do gifts get exercised?
Be used to build up the whole body.
And gifts are owned by the whole body, right? I mean, over here, the gifts are personally owned. I have the gift of tongues. I have the gift of, fill in the blank, of administration, or I have whatever gift. Here, though, all gifts are part of the whole. So if you can sew on buttons, all right, as a gift, then you don't own that gift alone. And you personally exercise that gift, but it's owned corporately by all of us. And you sew on buttons on behalf of all of us, or whatever it is. It's all of us together. Grace and commitment, how they each have to do with each other. It's people involved with one another in relationship. All right, in relationship. That relationship causes people to become passionate. All right, let me stop there and let's talk a little bit and argue a little bit, and maybe we can work out the implications of this. Thoughts, ideas. I'll do it all again. Yeah.
When you talk about passion versus the understatement, the passion to persuade versus the passion to coerce.
Yeah.
In your own personal ethic as a pastor or as a member of the body of Christ, is it better to identify if you're a persuader or you're a coercer? Or then the question comes that,